Welcome to the sixth class of this fresh start in 3D modeling. In previous classes, here's what we have covered. In class 1, we learned some fundamentals about 3D design. We went through the Cinema 4D interface. We learned some important modeling tools and we understood how subdivisions work. In class 2, we learned how to model 3D products, starting with cylinders as our primitives. We also practiced by modeling 4 different products with their detailed covers. In class 3, we learned how to create holes and extrude new shapes from an existing mesh. In class 4, we learned how to model a complete kettle by applying lessons from previous classes. In class 5, we learned how to model a headset from a flat surface. We also learned how to achieve that using the symmetrical modeling technique. In this final class of the series, we'll cover basic animation, material creation, lighting, and rendering. There are several ways you can take part in this series and also support the series and the channel at large. First, you can kindly subscribe to the channel to get more classes and to get notified for subsequent series and 3D content. And you can also join my 3D community on Telegram for more conversations, tips, challenges, resource sharing, and growth opportunities. Then you can also grab the Fresh Start bundle of clay image references. It consists of over 25 clay product references to help you practice and model more products after you take part in this training. Also, if you're into NFTs, you can patronize my Vogbot NFT project on OpenSea that has a crazy utility where I create a free animated fashion NFT for every piece sold. Animation is simply recording and applying motion to objects, tools, modifiers, and elements using their attributes or properties. To have a foundational understanding of animation, you need to understand these two terms, frame and keyframe. First, to explain what the frame is, let's break down a word that you're more familiar with, and that's the word video or movie. Now, every video that you watch is made up of a sequence of images that, when compiled and encoded, produces the motion that you see. This is why it's also called motion picture, which simply means moving images. The images in the sequence will gradually differ from each other based on what is being recorded. And this also explains what happens when you pause a video. You freeze a particular frame or image at any time you want. So we can refer to a single or individual image or unit of an entire sequence as a frame. Now let's go to the second term, which is keyframing. A keyframe records the attributes or properties of an object, tool, effect, or element at a particular frame or point in time. Now the key word here is recording attributes and frame or point in time. Please take note of these two words. So the transition from one keyframe to another is what creates your animation. So let's go ahead to practically explain this. So we want to animate this cube from this point to this point. Say we want to move it from here to here, but we want it to be recorded in our timeline. So let's go over our keywords. So one of our keywords was our time. So if you look down here, this is our timeline. And this is where you can find your frames. So our timeline currently consists of 250 frames, and you can increase this by just clicking and dragging. And this indicates the particular frame we are currently working on. So if I move, you see that number gradually changes. And now if I stop here, we're on frame 110. So this is our sequence of frames, which would then be converted to time when we're ready to encode a video. So the next keyword is our properties or attributes, and that's what we have here. So here I'm in my object properties. So to create an animation, we can either do it here live, or we can do it in the property panel here by clicking any of these dots beside the property you want. So if I click here, you see that it has keyframed that, and then if you just go to our timeline, you see that it has added a keyframe here. So for this cube, we want to work with the location on the y-axis. So this is the property we need here. So if I click on this dot, you see that it adds a keyframe here, and if you come to our timeline, it inserts a keyframe at frame 0. So note the relationship between our property and then our timeline. This is very important to create an animation. So this has currently recorded the location on the y-axis on frame 0. So now if I go to frame 90 and I adjust this position, say I drag it to this point here, and I go over here now and add another keyframe, so I will left click here again, you see now that it has added a keyframe at frame 90. So if I go back to frame 0 or frame 1 and I play this, you see that it transitions from the property set at 0 to the property I've now set at frame 90. So if I want to animate this back, I can go to frame 180 here, and then I can change the property back to 0. Then I'll hit keyframe again, and then that's marked that. If you don't keyframe it, you've not recorded that particular attribute. So let's play this from top to bottom. So to go to that position, then to come back to the beginning. So another way to do this without going to our object properties is to use a keyboard shortcut and also our auto keying here. So what auto keying does is it automatically applies a keyframe once you change a property. So you don't need to manually click to keyframe, you just need to change the property of the object. So what I would love to do is to first mark my first keyframe, then I can use my auto keying to add other keyframes. So to do that, we can hit I on our keyboard, and then to ask you to choose where you want to insert the keyframe. So is it the location, the rotation, the scale, location and rotation, or any of these options here? So since we're working with only the location, I'll just check location here. If you want to keyframe multiple properties, you can just choose this option here, which has everything. So now I'll just check location. And note that this has applied the keyframe again as frame 0 for me. So I'll turn on my auto keying. So now if I go to frame 90, once I begin to move this object on the y-axis and I drop it, you see that it applies a keyframe for me automatically because my auto keying is on. So if I go now to frame 180, I can just click and drag this back, and it has applied another keyframe for me. So if we play this from the top, this is what it looks like. So let's apply this for the headset we've created. There are more advanced tools to control your animation using your graph editor, but for this basic tutorial, I won't be going over that. So before I animate this headset, the first thing I want to do is to attach these two objects into a null, so that I can apply one animation on both objects. So in Blender, it's called empty. Let's see how that works. So if I hit Shift A on my keyboard, and then I come to empty here and just select plane axis, then I'll select these two objects. And if you hold Shift as you click and drag, you'll be able to parent it to this empty. So I'm holding Shift, then I'll just drop this here under empty. So if I open this up now, you see that these two objects have become a child of this empty here. So before that, empty was just, as the word suggests, empty, nothing in it. So we can just call this headset empty. So now if I move this empty here, I move these two objects together. So I want to apply an animation on this object and also apply an animation to our camera. So first I'll change the dimension to 1080 by 1080 in our output properties here. Then I'll add our camera, so I'll hit Shift A and then select camera. For this camera, I'll go to the object properties and I'll just set this to 90, and I'll set the rotation on the y-axis to 0, rotation on the z-axis to 0. So I just want it to face our object here. So to make this camera our active object, you hit Ctrl 0 on your numpad, or you go to View, Cameras, and then set active object as camera. So once you select that, it will bring you into the view of the camera. So we can use our basic move controls to also move the camera. So if I hit G, I can grab this camera and just place it. So there are different ways you can control your camera. You can go to View, and under Navigation, you can enable Walk Navigation. This simply lets you use WASD, just like you're playing a game, to control your camera. So W to zoom in, S to zoom out, A to move towards the left, D to move towards the right. So your mouse is also like your eye. So now I'm clicking A and then just using my mouse to look around this way. And then now I'm hitting D and using my mouse to look at it this way. So I'll just set that back to 0 and 0 here and make this also 90. So the only thing I want to work with here is the zoom. Another shortcut I can use to zoom in and out is I can hit G twice, then I'll hit Z. Then I'll be able to zoom in and out of my camera. So let's just work with this view in our camera. So I'll hit 0 on my numpad to go out of my camera view. So to animate the headset, I will make sure I've selected the headset empty here. Then I just want to work with the rotation on the Z-axis here. So I'll hit I to insert a keyframe. Then I'll select these options here to insert the keyframe at frame 0. Then I'll go to my rotate tool, or I can use R and Z. So I'll go to frame 90 and then I'll just rotate this way. Then I can hit I again and then add a keyframe. or I could use my auto keying as we practiced earlier. So if you left click and drag, you can drag this closer, and what that will simply do is to make your animation faster. So if we play this is what we should have. You see it's faster, and then with more frames it will just make it slower. So I'll just place this at 90 here. Then to quickly add an animation to our camera, I'll select our camera, I'll hit 0 on my numpad to go into the view of the camera, and I'll make sure I'm at frame 0. So always remember to check where you are in your timeline before you add your keyframe. So now I'll enable our auto keying, then I'll just insert a keyframe here. I'll select this option, then I'll also go to frame 90. Then remember, because auto keying is on, once we start changing the property of the camera, it will apply a keyframe for us there. So I'll hit G twice, and then I'll hit Z to zoom in gradually this way. So I'll left click to place that. So if we go from the beginning, this is what we should have, our camera zooming in on the rotation of our headset. You can always play with this using the understanding of what a keyframe is. So for instance, you know that the location and rotation is already keyframed here. So no matter what you do at this area, it will always end up at this position that you've made here. So if we come to the middle or anywhere around the middle here, and we just distort, say, the rotation of this empty, remember our auto keying is on, you see now that we'll have something dynamic like this. So it will start from where we placed it before, and now it will rotate, and then it will come back to this position. We need to create a material, and it's from that material we'll derive what the object should look like, whether it should be shiny, glossy, transparent, metallic, or even driven by an image texture. For this particular tutorial, we'll be creating simple materials. For this body here, we'll create a shiny red material, and for this we'll create a rough black material. So let's move to how we create materials on Blender. So if I select this object here, I can go to my material properties here also. Then when I click this, if I've not created any material, it will show me this option. So once I click new, it will show me these default material settings. So for now, we can change this view to our material preview mode so we can see our materials. So I'll hit Z, and then I'll just select material preview. So all these parameters controls the look of our object. But for the material we'll be creating for this basic tutorial, we'll be working with the base color, a little metalness, our specular, and roughness. So it's key to note that our object is currently reacting to a default light setup in Blender. So that helps us preview our material well before we set up our own lights. So first, let's change this color to red here. Then I'll just add a little metalness, just a little. I don't need it to be metallic. I'll just add a little for now. So next, our specular. Our specular controls the shininess and reflectivity of our object as it reacts to light. So these shiny areas you can see currently on this object is due to our specular set at 0.5. If I take this to 0, you see that the shininess goes away. And if I take this to 1, you see that the shininess is exaggerated. So we can leave this at 0.8 for now. Now the next thing is our roughness. Now roughness controls the roughness of our reflections. So currently this object is not so reflective because our roughness is set to 0.5. But if we take this roughness down to 0, you see now that our reflections are not rough, and it reflects the default environment set up in Blender. So for now, let's just set this to around 0.2. We can come back to tweak this when we make our final light setup. So we can leave the body like that, and let's go to this other object. So I'll go to the material properties of this object, and I'll create a new material. If I wanted to apply this red material that I've created, I can just click here to open this menu, and then I can select this material here. But that's not what I want to do, so I want to create a new material for this object here. I'll almost do the same thing, but I'll just make this black. I won't add any metalness. I'll leave the specular at 0.5, and then I'll also leave the roughness this way. So this way I've created my basic material for this object. You can play around with these parameters and see how it affects your object, or better still, you can wait to set up your light and then come back to these parameters to play with them. So next, let's set up our light. So I'll return to our solid mode, and before we set up our light, let's create a studio scene for this object. So I'll bring a plane in, Then I'll extrude this edge on the z-axis. Then I'll just place this here this way. Then I'll select this edge again and I'll bevel it using Ctrl B. Then I'll just add some nice subdivisions here. Then I'll go to my object mode and then I'll change the shading to smooth. So I'll just rename this BG. So lighting is simply adding light to our scene. And for this, you can add different types of light on Blender, or you can also light your scene using something called HDRI environment. So an HDRI environment is like a scanned image that uses the physical properties of an actual environment to light your scene. So just imagine your current environment in 360, the way the atmosphere is looking and how you have multiple light sources from bulbs, street lamps, and other light sources. So making an HDR environment from that will be like scanning that particular environment and then converting it into an HDRI format, which is usually .hdr or .axr. And then when you bring that to your 3D software, it will use the physical properties, the way that particular environment is lit, to then light your scene. So then you can have multiple light sources and you can have something close to being realistic. But first, let's experiment with a particular light. So if you hit Shift A and you go to light, you see the options of lights we have here. So you can bring the sun, spotlight, or area light. You can play with some of these other options in your spare time. But I'll just bring the point light in to demonstrate how this works. So let's switch to our render mode here. So I'll hit Z and select render. So now that we switch to render mode, we need to ensure that we're using the right renderer. So if you go to render properties over here, I'll change the render engine to cycles, as that will give us more realistic results. So now with this light selected, if I go to the light properties and I just increase this to 500 watts, you see how that light has taken effect on our scene. And then as I move this light, it affects the way it casts shadows on our background. So I'll just take that down to 200 or 100 for now, but I'll leave it in the scene. Now let's use a HDR environment to light the scene. So to do that, you come over here to your world properties. And then naturally, this color controls the color of your environmental light. So if I were to increase the lightness of this now, you see that it affects the lighting of our scene. But this is just a plain or linear light source. So we can now change the source of this lighting to a HDR environment. So to do that, click this circle over here, and then here we select environment texture. So click open here to open the file we need. So I'll select the HDRI texture that I'll also attach for you in the description below. And you can see how it has created interesting light reflections for me at this area. And if I try another studio light setup, this is also what we have. You see we have interesting reflections here. So let's see this through our camera. So I'll use the Studio 2 HDRI for the final output. Rendering is a very important stage as it takes into account the quality of the previous steps you've gone through. So it's where you see how good your model is, how good your texturing is, how good your light setup is, and depending on the renderer you're using, how realistic your image or video will come out. So there are different renderers you can use for your project. Blender comes with Cycles by default and 2 other renderers. Cycles produces more realistic results as it reads the physical properties of your scene better. There are also external renderers you can use for your project like Octane, Arnold, V-Ray, I-Ray, Corona, Redshift, and many more. All these different renderers just have a way of interpreting all the actions you've made in your scene and producing the best output possible. Then next, let's go to our output properties. You can set the final dimension for your scene. I already set this to 1080 by 1080 when I was creating the camera. Now if you're rendering an image, you might not even need to come here first to pick the location. You can render it directly here, render image, and then save it in your render view. So it will render the particular frame you're on. So take for instance, if I go to frame 70 and I just click render image, it will start rendering that particular image for me. So when this is done rendering, you can go to image, click save, and then just select the location you want to save the file, and then click save as image. Or if you want to go to a file directly, you can come here and then just select the location where you want to save the file. So now if you want to render this set of frames as a video directly, we can do that in our output settings here. So first here, select where you want to save this. I'll click accept, and then to impute the file directory there. Then change the file format to FFmpeg video. Then under encoding here, you can select this option here, MPEG 4. Then come down to video, make sure this is H.264. You can check this to high quality. Sampling is helpful in denoising your renders. It helps to assure clean and crisp renders. So the more the samples, the more your render gets refined. And then the lesser the samples, the more noise you see in your scene. You can also set the time limit, but we'll just leave that and just work with our samples here. So for this particular tutorial, because this is more of a preview, I'll set this to 200, but that might not necessarily ensure crisp and clean render. So when you're doing yours, you can use higher samples. Also ensure you've set the total frames here to the duration of the animation in your timeline. For this project, we're using 90 frames. So now I'll go ahead to render our scene. I'll go to render, and instead of choosing render image, I will select render animation. Then you just wait for your frames to render sample by sample. When you're done rendering in Blender, check the file location you selected earlier, and this is what you should have. All your frames encoded into a video. Thank you so much for taking part in this series. I had such a great experience doing this in both Cinema 4D and Blender. You can now go ahead to practice with more products. Use this foundational knowledge you have to explore more tutorials on YouTube, and I'll be there in the community to assist you, so make sure you bring this conversation to the community. I'll also make subsequent tutorials and series, so make sure you subscribe and stay in touch. Thank you once again, and God bless you and help you in your 3D journey.